I'd like to read from 1 John chapter 2, beginning with the 7th verse. Dear friends, I am not writing you a new command, but an old one, which you have known from the beginning. The old command is the message that you have heard. Yet I am writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Now, John talks about a new command and an old command. What's he talking about? Jesus used some of the same language. In the second chapter here of John, he has just been linking the whole idea of loving God with the importance of obedience. And the Bible, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, for example. The Bible constantly links these two ideas that if we love God, we're going to do what God says do. That's at first sounds like, well, of course, that's the way it would be. And yet, so many times, when we disobey God, we don't think of it in terms of a weak love or a lack of love for God. This whole idea of loving God comes from the idea that God is the one who has unfathomable love. Love that is so deep and true and meaningful that it really is just beyond our imagination. And we'll talk about that just a little bit this evening as we go along. Once we embrace this idea that loving God and obeying God are so strongly linked together, it puts our motivation for obedience, it just puts it in a very different light than it was before. You know, when we're growing up and we're first beginning to be introduced to the idea of obeying God and so forth, it comes to be, you've got to do this, got to do this, got to do this. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And I feel like I'm kind of confined here. On the other hand, we learn from our parents that because our parents love us, they restrict us in some ways. Because they love us, they guide us and they discipline us, and they punish us when we disobey. And, you know, like the writer of Hebrews says, no punishment is enjoyable at the time. By the way, if it was, it wouldn't be punishment at all, would it? And so punishment is that way. But the idea here is that when we really learn to love God, our obedience is motivated by our love for God and not by the demand that he makes on us. That's really, it's a hard lesson for me to learn. Maybe that's one reason I say a lot about that, is because it really is a hard lesson for me to learn. So that I don't feel that I'm being restricted. I feel instead I'm being lovingly disciplined so that I can become a better person in the eyes of God. Well, so much of the time, the things that are old revive and become brand new to us. You know, as I was growing up, I was very fortunate to have grown up in a very loving family. My mom and dad loved each other. They loved us kids, 4 of us. They loved us children and all. And so I grew up in that kind of an atmosphere. It's a very secure thing. And then as I became a Christian and I began learning more and more of God's love for me, this whole thing of love took on a new meaning. And so there are some old things that because of the circumstances in our lives, they become very new. And then, you know, I fell in love with a lady that just renewed the the whole idea of love for me. And that's the way life is. As we move along, we learn to love more and more, and we learn to branch out on this love, and love becomes a very, very important thing to us. Well, what is this old commandment then that John was talking about and that the Lord was talking about? The greatest commandment. You don't need to try this, but just imagine trying it. You stop somebody, you don't know him, stop him on the street and say, hello, my name is so-and-so, and I'd like for you to tell me what is the most important thing in the world so far as you're concerned. Have you ever stopped to think about what answer you might get back? Well, some people might say, I think that it's the world economy. I think it's our national economy. I think it's our foreign policy. I think that it's the global economy, global peace, and all things like that. Or you might get a little bit more of a personal answer from him, where it says, I think the most important thing for me is that I provide for my family. Another might say, most important thing for me is to be successful in life. If I'm successful in life, there are so many things I can do. Then a person might say, I believe the most important thing is for all of us to just be good people. Another fellow may say, I think the most important thing is to live life to its fullest, have all the fun you can, because you only live once. Okay? There are all kinds of answers to that. Do you remember this movie quite a number of years ago with Jack Nicholson called The Bucket List? Well, here, the bucket list was this. It came from the idea, of course, that when you die, the slang thing is what? You kick the bucket. That's the slang thing. So the idea was, what's in that bucket? And Jack Nicholson and the friend that he had met, they decided that they would fill that bucket with all of the things that they really wanted to do before they died. They had Jack did, he had terminal disease. He knew he was going to die. What am I going to do? And so all kinds of interesting things that they did. Just, I want to do this before I die, and so forth. Well, Jesus was asked that question, and he didn't say anything about a bucket list. He didn't say anything about being successful, but he did tell us what was most important. And what was it? It's a very simple thing. Mark chapter 12. One of the teachers of the law came and while they were debating, noticing that Jesus had given an answer to a question that he raised, he talked about how important that was. What was the question? What is the greatest commandment? And the greatest commandment, Jesus said, was to love God. Love God entirely. Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And then he says there's another one like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so when Jesus said that, the lawyer gave a real fine response to it. He said, that's, of all of the commandments, he said, the most important one here is to love the Lord your God. And then the lawyer said, that's greater, that's more important than all the burnt offerings. Stop and think about that. How important the burnt offerings were to the Jewish people. And this lawyer said, when Jesus gave him that answer, this lawyer said, oh yes, that's right. That the most important thing is to love. And so his exact words were, to love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. Now here's Jesus' response to it. Jesus saw that he answered wisely. And Jesus said, you're not far from the kingdom of God. The whole picture that's being painted here is a very important one, where Jesus is telling this man, this is what life really ought to be. Now we have a lot of different situations in life, and so in all of those situations, this is what it ought to be. J.P. Sanders spoke in chapel one time at Lipscomb. He was speaking on love, and he said, when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, he had the 13th chapter, the love chapter of the Bible. And it's a beautiful chapter. And he said, after he gives a list of these things that characterize love, he ended that part of it up by saying, love never fails. And then J.P. Sanders added to that, he said, yes, but we say love never fails. However, love never fails, but in this situation, love never fails, but this is an exception. And so we lose sight of the strength of love because we feel like that there's some other way that we need to handle things. Love of family, love of husbands, wives, children. Love that exists in a family is so very, very important. And this is a part of this whole thing that never grows old. Then in 1 John again, chapter 3 and verse 18, John says, let's not love in word, neither with the tongue, but love in deed and in truth. It's so easy to say, now I'm telling you this because I love you. Well, when people say that to me, I think they're telling me this, trying to cover it up, but they're not telling me this because they love me. You see, I don't have to tell people that I love them before I scold them. I need to scold them in a way, discipline their children, for example, in a way so that this is an act of love as well as an act of discipline. It's so difficult for us to really absorb this. Why? Because we are thrown into so many unlovable situations. We're thrown into so many situations where it seems that love cannot solve this. We're thrown in with people that are very difficult to get along with. And so we don't treat those people with love. We treat them in a reactionary way, or sometimes we treat them in a very arrogant way. But love needs to dominate. Love needs to permeate all of these things so that we don't love, as John says, don't love in word. Not because I tell you I love you, but because instead, John says, because I show you that I love you. And then these difficult people in these difficult situations, we can walk into these things with the idea of love will solve the problem. Does love always solve the problem? No, it doesn't. Some people will not accept our love. That doesn't relieve me from the importance of showing love. Love comes closer towards solving problems than arrogance does. Arrogance creates more problems. Love tends to solve problems. Well, what is new about this commandment? Jesus spoke of this very same thing in John 13. Let me read from it. A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this all men will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. There's a strange thing that took place in the 2nd century. You see, the Roman world was such a different world than we think of. We think of the Roman world as, very arrogant and very warlike and all this sort of thing, and that they certainly were. But the idea of loving your enemy, or the idea of love solving everything, that was very remote to these people. But then when Christianity came along, and let me say again, I've said this a number of times, the churches in the New Testament were very, very small. Probably our attendance this morning, which was I think 46 or 47, something like that, our attendance this morning would have been a pretty good sized church in many of the situations in the New Testament. They were small enough that they met in homes. And so we stop and wonder, how was it that that Christianity became such an influence in the Roman Empire that it destroyed Roman paganism after about 200 to 300 years? It destroyed paganism. And yet it all came from such a very small little nucleus of people. How did that happen? It happened because the people loved one another. And as a matter of fact, in the midst of persecution, there was a great deal of confusion along this line, because sometimes the Christians would protect one another to the point that the protector actually gave his life for the person he was protecting. And so the slogan came up, or the question came up, my, how these Christians love each other. How these Christians love each other. When we learn to love each other, we don't say bad things about each other. We don't gossip about each other. We don't tell tales about each other. We try instead to solve problems that might arise between us and someone else. And so Jesus said, love one another. What's the key to it? Next statement. Love one another what? As I have loved you. That's what's new about the commandment. Because Jesus exemplified the very love that he said that we ought to have for other people. That we ought to have for one another. There's a statement that Paul made in Philippians chapter 2 that I think shows something about this very important aspect of love. Love of Christ was a sacrificial love. He left heaven and came to the earth. Why? For us, for our benefit. And so the Apostle Paul wrote a very complex but a very lovely and beautiful poem about this. In Philippians 2, beginning with the 5th verse, he says, your attitude ought to be the same as that of Christ Jesus. Literally, when I was taking my second year of Greek, I had to memorize this whole thing in the Greek in the Greek text, and I remember the word here for attitude. It literally says, think this in you. Think this in you. What do you want us to think in us, Paul? Think this in you that is the same as Christ thought in himself. And so it says, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, and being made in the likeness of man. Being found in the appearance of man, he humbled himself and became obedient, even to death. Yes, the death of the cross. Therefore God highly exalted him and gave him a name that is above every name, that in the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and things under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, the Master, to the glory of God the Father. Now, there's another interesting word here. When it says he emptied himself, this is a very strong word. The Greek word is kenosis, and this word means to completely empty the jar or the glass of its contents. It is as if I had a glass up here and I just turned it upside down and every drop of water came out of it. And Jesus was willing to empty himself. Empty himself of his relationship to God. Empty himself of the closeness of God. Empty himself from the wonders and the beauties of heaven to become a human being. And when we read the book of Hebrews, we find out that not only was he a human being, but he was a human being just like we are. The writer of Hebrews tells us that he was made in all points like we are. And he goes on and says he was tempted in every way just like we are. Now that's really something. He was tempted just like I'm tempted. I'm tempted in this way and that way, and you're tempted in various ways. We all are. Jesus was tempted exactly the same way. I remember when I was teaching in Vienna, Austria, I brought this up to one of the classes I was teaching. Was Jesus ever tempted to do evil? And there was a young man there who was very outspoken, and he was very devoted to the church that he was going to, and he immediately spoke up and said, no, he was not tempted like I'm tempted. Oh, yes, he was. He was. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is that Jesus' love was a sacrificial love. He was willing to give up everything for me, for you. He was really willing to rid himself of his equality with God and empty himself. He was willing to become completely human, although he was divine. He was willing to humble himself, although he was exalted. He was willing to die on the cross for the most ungodly people in the world. His love was a sacrificial love. And so I need to learn that in my relationship with other people, I need to be the one who sacrifices my time, who sacrifices my energy, who sacrifices my work, who sacrifices myself for the good of someone else. That's the love that Christ had for us. Now, I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes. His love was unconditional. You know, I've thought about this a number of times. Jesus died for the worst of us. Jesus died for all of the drug addicts. Jesus died for all of the murderers. Jesus died for all of the ruthless rulers of history. Jesus died for the torturous people. Jesus died for those who are violent. Jesus died for the worst of us. And so you see, his love was not conditioned on, I'll die for the people who are good. I'll die for the people who will love me. I will sacrifice myself for the people who will exalt me. No. Jesus, when he came, he didn't live in royalty, although he was the king. He didn't live in royalty. He lived instead as a poor man. And as a poor man, he served other people. His love was unconditional. His love was consistent. It didn't change from one day to another. Well, I found out something about this person that I didn't like, and now I withdraw myself from that person. Maybe we ought to love that person a little bit more. I heard a lady teach a class of ladies one time, and the statement came back about, she was talking about home life and raising children and all that, and this statement came back from her where she said, you know, when your children are the most unlovable, that's when they need love the most. When they're the most unlovable, that's when they need love the most. Well, I think that idea can be translated into not just children, but into all of our relationships of life, that when people are our adversaries, when people are the most unloving to us, when people are the most arrogant to us, when people want to injure our reputation or injure us, that's when we need to express our love in the things that we do in the way we act toward them, even more so than when they're to us. You know, while I was preparing this lesson, I thought about this. Let's just say that you were on a bridge, and you're walking across this bridge, and there's a man. It's night, you know, and all this sort of thing. And there's a man coming the other way, and as he just about passes you, he starts to fight with you. And he has a knife with him. And he's going to do everything he can to stab you and kill you. And you're fighting back, trying to protect yourself. And in this whole thing, he falls off the bridge. And he's underwater, and he can't swim. Would you jump off the bridge to rescue that man? Well, my answer is no, I wouldn't. I'd just say, tough, you know. I wouldn't, would you? That's what Jesus did. He died for the people who were killing him. He died for the people who were his enemies. His love was so consistent that whether you're a good person or a bad person, whether you're a truthful person or a lying person, whether you're an upright person or the dregs of society, he died for you because he loves you. His love was consistent. His love was unconditional. His love was so sacrificial. Yes, in the sense of the word, Jesus jumped off of that bridge to rescue the man who is trying to kill him. Now, maybe that gets, I hope anyway, that gets the idea of the love of Christ to us a little bit more realistically. Because that's what he did. When we were sinners, Paul says in Romans, Christ died for us. Not when we were good. Not when we were noble. Not when we were benevolent. But when we were sinners, Christ died for us. Now, Jesus said, here's a new commandment. Love one another. Well, wait, he didn't stop there. Love one another as I have loved you. And then he says, this is the way the world will know. This is the way where the world will know that God sent you. And so this new commandment, this old commandment rather, that has become new, is new because Jesus exemplified it in such wonderful ways. As we live our lives, as we relate to other people, let's try to remember that the old commandment to love is really made new in Jesus Christ when we learn to love as he loved us. If you are present tonight and you're not a Christian, we're going to sing an invitation song that Joe has announced, and we invite you to respond if you have any need at all. Let's stand together and sing, please.